FICCI, on behalf of FICCI West Bengal State Council and the Bengal Club, it is my great pleasure to invite Professor Rana Mitter to speak in general about modern China, but also about his latest book, China's Good War, which hopefully we will have in Bengal Club soon, and we will read. But I invited Rana to speak with us partly because, as a neighbor, and a large neighbor at that, and a major global power, the country is still an enigma. We probably don't understand the way the country ticks, and Rana's mentioned in some of his lectures that China keeps looking at its past to make sense of its present. So it would be great to hear from him about the modern past of China. Obviously, it's a country with a very long history, but there's a lot of discussion of the 100 years from the Opium War till the Second World War, which was described as a century of humiliation. But the 70 or 80 years since then has been an incredibly tumultuous period, where it started with this very long drawn out war, starting, in Rana's book, I read about the Marco Polo Bridge incident. Seemed like a relatively minor incident to start off such a long drawn war. And China was the first belligerent, or China and Japan were the first belligerents in the war. And it's stuck out for a long time, a very weak country, till 1945. And then right after the Second World War, we talk about Winston Churchill being kicked out after the Second World War. This was much bigger. The entire government, nationalist government, was taken over by the communists. And there was a civil war. And then the World War was hardly spoken about. And then there was a period of, tragedy, with so many deaths during the Cultural Revolution, but also incredible economic performance. And it's difficult to, understand, how should we deal with this country? Should we treat it as an aggressive force, belligerent against neighbors, and countries far away, as a poor country, coming to terms with prosperity and becoming a big supplier to the world? And I think there's very few people in the world who can speak as eloquently about the subject of China in the modern time as Professor Rana Mitter. Rana, I would invite you to first, very general question on that period from the Second World War. How did China get in, and where did we? If you can give us a big overview of the country and what happened over this long period, and then this is going to be just question and answer, and I would invite all of you to ask questions. Those of your attendees, please type it in, and others can please ask the questions. Welcome, Rana, on behalf of FICCI and Bengal Club.
Thank you very much indeed, Rudra. And may I also first express my own thanks to you for organizing this event, despite the difficulties of distance and the pandemic. I'm glad to see that technology and goodwill have brought us all together into what I think is going to be a fascinating discussion. I'd also like to thank not just FICCI and the Bengal Club, but all the various organizations and people I know who've been involved in bringing this together. And I should say, as someone who I think I'm right in saying has been past the doors of the Bengal Club on many occasions in younger days, but maybe not yet entered into them, I'd like to put it on record that I shall have to come in and visit in person one of these days when we are amidst travel. So let me respond to your invitation by taking just a few minutes to lay out a particular question. And it has essentially two parts, and I'll try and be quite concise on both, but I think that they're both important. One is to understand what happened in China during World War II. And the second point, just to make it clear that this is not something of purely historical interest, is to suggest that this is something that really matters in terms of shaping contemporary China. The China that we see today, the China that you know is often a problematic neighbor, sometimes cooperative, sometimes more confrontational with India. Also, of course, very much the case in terms of the changing, a more turbulent relationship with the Western world as well. And I'm going to suggest, I hope, plausibly, that the Second World War experience more than 75 years ago does still have a great deal of relevance in terms of understanding why China acts as it does, both domestically and internationally. And just to explain with a couple of examples of why I say it matters in the present day, the way I'd explain this is to say that if you look in detail at what China, and when I say China, I mean its elites, I mean its middle class, I mean its social media, all sorts of different aspects of that society, when they talk about themselves, when they talk about politics, when they talk about their own society, they talk about a whole variety of different things. Some of those things I think are well known. So nobody in this conversation, and I know at least some of you have quite a bit of China expertise. Others I know have expertise elsewhere, not necessarily have China at the center of your thinking. But I think for everyone, the idea that China's economic miracle, this huge level of economic growth and of poverty reduction is, of course, a story that's well known globally. And of course, in terms of China's narrative about itself, that's become a very well-known story. Or indeed China's story about itself in the world linked to the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. Again, I think that's a term that pretty much everyone will recognize, the idea that China is doing a combination of international development gifts and loans at various rates of interest to infrastructure development projects around Asia, Africa, and even beyond. So those, if I may say so, are some of the probably better known stories about how China thinks of itself in the world. But there's another story too. So for instance, when Foreign Minister Wang Yi went last year, the last time so far he could do so in person because of the pandemic, to the Munich Security Conference, probably the world's most prominent gathering of people working on security and defense issues. He made it very clear that he considered it important that China was a country that had been not just a signatory, but the very first signatory, at least in the order of names on the paper, to the United Nations Charter in San Francisco in April 1945. In other words, that the creation of the order that came out of the Second World War, which the Americans have generally implied or sometimes explicitly stated was pretty much a creation of their own. You know, Washington remakes the world in 1945 and we're still living with it. Well, the Chinese are saying, no, actually, that post-war world was created by us and our sacrifices and our geopolitical aims as well. Another example, when the pandemic hit, one of the very first metaphors, one of the very first analogies that the Chinese leadership from Xi Jinping downwards came to talk about was the expression "people's war," 人民战争, a phrase taken identically from Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao's war against the Japanese in the 1930s and 1940s, and which has basically been translated wholesale into a new war against not the Japanese, but the virus. So metaphors and analogies from that wartime period remain very powerful as well. And just to make it clear, this is not just all about implication or metaphor or analogy. Xi Jinping himself has also said very explicitly, very clearly, why he thinks China in the 21st century, in the 2010s and 2020s, where we are now, why it should pay so much attention to its own history during the Second World War. And he says it's because that was the first war in which China was invaded by a foreign enemy and fought back and won. So he's very clear that that's why, in terms of the historical narrative and the geopolitical standing that it gives China, that's why World War II is important. So let me use that very contemporary statement by Xi Jinping, but perhaps not one of his best known statements in the outside world, to just give a very few facts and figures and statistics about the World War II experience of China itself. Because even amongst many people, both professional scholars and those who just love history, the history of the World War II period, I think, is one that has become uh, well known. For people living in Western Europe, obviously it's very much part of the formational history. And recent fantastic books by Raghavan, by Khan and others on India's experience during World War II have also become major scholarly works that also have had a lot of general readership. So India's wartime story has also become more prominent recently. But the story of China's experience in World War II, I think it's fair to say, is perhaps the least well-known combat theater of World War II. So different from India in that sense. Certainly of any of the major belligerents. The Pacific, which is different from the China War, is well known. The European War, of course, is tremendously well known. But the Chinese War, not so much. So it's worth remembering that for the Chinese, the war lasted longer than in any other theater of war, from 1937 and the Marco Polo Bridge, which you mentioned in your comments, the outbreak of war between Chinese and Japanese troops stationed just outside Beijing in the summer of 1937, and that war expanded and continued for 8 years until the ending of the war very suddenly with the atomic bombings of Japan in 1945. So it's the longest war for the Chinese. Then beyond that, you also have the horrors of what actually happened to the population. Statistics still hard to come by, but broadly speaking, responsible figures suggest that anything between 8 to 14 million Chinese were killed during the war. Not all as direct combat casualties, that should be made clear, but both military and civilian casualties were real. There were all sorts of other war-driven deaths, just as in Bengal, as everyone here will know, very clearly. China also had a wartime famine caused by the policies of the war and the inability of the administration to provide food and support. And that was in Henan province and killed in a parallel with the Bengal experience, something like 4 million people. In addition, bacteriological warfare, the drowning of peasants when the dikes were blasted actually by the Chinese nationalist government, all of these add up to huge numbers of deaths, casualties, and also refugee relocation. Again, in India, one tends to think of partition in 1947 as the period of the greatest refugee turmoil, crisis, and tragedy in recent Indian history, perhaps along with, of course, the Bangladesh War in 71. For China, it was the World War II experience that created an atmosphere that was, created a phenomenon that led to something like 80 to 100 million Chinese becoming refugees during that period. So again, a traumatic, deeply scarring experience, which unsurprisingly stays on the minds of the Chinese people as a whole. Beyond that, we should also note that the carefully built infrastructure, the railways, roads, and other aspects of modernity built up in China over the late 19th, early 20th century, all were pretty much smashed to pieces by the experience of Japanese bombing during that period. So the China that essentially exited from World War II in 1945 was an extremely war-damaged and traumatized place. And then subsequent history, to just go through it very quickly, of course, continued to add to that trauma. A civil war followed very quickly between the ruling nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the insurgent communists under Mao Zedong. As is well known, Mao won in 1949. And one of the reasons why the story I've just told you, that the story of wartime China, tended to be less heard in the wider world in the following years of the Cold War, is that the primary fighters against the Japanese during those war years were the Chinese nationalists, the Kuomintang, under Chiang Kai-shek. The communists did maintain a very important resistance element, including particularly guerrilla warfare during that period, but they were not the primary fighters of the set piece battles. That was the nationalists. And after the nationalists were defeated and sent to Taiwan, or fled to Taiwan in 1949, it became politically very difficult under the communist leadership to actually talk about that nationalist contribution against the Japanese. And to get much closer to our own day, these stories converge, because it would say, well, if the nationalists were basically being sidelined in later history by the communists, why would World War II be so prominent in China today? And the short answer is that the story changed once more from the 1980s and 90s into the present day, when essentially for political reasons, such as the desire to reunify with Taiwan, the Chinese communists started changing their story and actually giving more credit more positive attribution to their old nationalist opponents, who they now admitted had actually fought alongside the communists in defiance of the Japanese. And that partial reconciliation could be seen in events such as the 2015 parade commemorating the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II in Asia, held in the most sacred spot for Chinese communism, the heart of Beijing in Tiananmen Square. And in the middle of that ceremony, with tanks and guns and uniformed soldiers, a small number of veterans, 8, I think, were presented to President Xi Jinping, 4 of them from the old communist armies, 4 of them from the old nationalist armies, a symbol of reconciliation with men who by then were in their 90s, so some were even over 100 years old, that suggested that that old wound, if not fully healed, at least had been absorbed, and China was looking to move on to a different era where patriotism was not necessarily defined by who you fought against the Japanese, but rather by the act of having done so. So that sense that World War II has moved in the communist leadership's mind from being a slightly difficult story because so many of their enemies, the Americans, the old nationalists of Chiang Kai-shek, were involved in the fight against the Japanese, to being a story where actually, in their own terms, and often in a highly manipulated way, nonetheless, today's Beijing can use aspects of that story, including the stories of their old opponents, to tell a story about itself. And to finish this thought and start our discussion, Rudra, I would say that the story that China wants to tell about itself using World War II is the following. Domestically, it's what Xi Jinping said, which is that there is at least this one occasion that we can come up with when China was invaded by a brutal imperialist occupier through no fault of its own, and somehow managed to bring people to resistance despite trauma and poverty and all of these great, terrible conditions, to fight back, eventually join up with allies and win. And this was a sign that the Chinese people in the end can be attacked and invaded, but never ultimately defeated. So that's the story for the patriotic nationalistic narrative at home. But there's a second part, and that's for the outside world. And that story, I think it's probably fair to say so far, has had less ability to stick than the domestic story. But the story is this. China wants to use World War II to argue that it's not just a powerful actor in the world, not just an economically growing actor in the world, but that also it is a moral actor in the world. Now, this has proved more and more difficult because we're all aware of the many human rights abuses against individual civilians in China, lawyers being arrested for protesting, or Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and so forth. And China wants to push back against these stories and essentially do what the Americans did, and to say that what they contributed during World War II was so important to the ultimate salvation of democracy and the future of the human species, that individual faults in the country don't matter so much. Now, China is not claiming to have used World War II to have made the world safe for democracy, of course not. But it is saying that it helped to make the world safe for that post-1945 world order that we still live with today. And that if human beings want to be prosperous, want to be stable, then they should take the lessons that China learned and gave out during that time, that fighting a moral war and winning it is a very important part of China's claim today to being a cooperative and stabilizing actor in international society. Now, as I say, that's China's political narrative. I'm sure that everyone here will have things to say about whether or not they believe that is an accurate assessment of what China's behavior has been. But I leave that thought there by explaining why it is that today telling the World War II story their way has become such a powerful element of China's presentation of its history, both to its own people and to a wider world, where the international community that emerged in 1945 from World War II is now changing very rapidly indeed. Rudra, I'll leave those thoughts there so that we can have a conversation. Let me throw it back to you.
Absolutely. And I'm going to ask for some questions in the order that we've discussed. But Rana, just as a follow-up question to your talk, what gives the government of China its legitimacy? It's when we talk about the CCP, we hear about the fact that this government fought the Japanese, and you are talking about, and you write in your book about how the nationalists were the leaders. Chiang Kai-shek was the leader, fighting against the Japanese, signed peace treaties, etc. There's a, stability is something that we hear quite a bit about China, the stable country with, but we talk about, the tumult that happened over the last, 60 years from the, and also economic progress, which isn't really a communist, process by which that economic progress happened. So what do you think what is the stated and real sources of legitimacy?
Absolutely. So I would say, I mean, there are a whole variety, but to keep it concise, let me just limit to 3 or 4, which I think are most important. First of all, and I think the one that's become best known, and you mentioned it, which is economic legitimacy. And I think that the Communist Party would say at least 2 things about that. And they perhaps change the emphasis over time, but the basic elements remain the same. The first thing they'd say is that if you look at the figures, there's the bare cold statistics at where China was in the 1970s and where it is now, it has moved a very, very long way. Today, China's per capita GDP is about $10,000 a year, which makes it firmly a lower middle income country. The less generous Chinese commentators do quite often point to India and suggest that the equivalent per capita income is much lower, sometimes, depending on some calculations, even less than half of that. My own feeling is that that's not enough in and of itself to necessarily justify a political system, but using the statistics is one tactic that certainly Chinese defenders of the system will use, and it obviously has to be argued with seriously. It's worth noting that in some parts of China, Shanghai, the Greater Bay Area in southern China, per capita GDP actually is close to about $23,000 to $25,000 a year. In other words, a bit more like Southern Europe. Although the fact that in the interior of China, you still have some people living on less than $6 a day shows how wide the contrasts are. And actually, China has one of the world's worst Gini coefficients in terms of inequality, worse than India, I think, but not quite as bad as the United States. So all of that is by way of saying, look, the figures show that we have created genuine economic growth. This is not just some sort of slogan we use, it's really there. And they would say that it doesn't matter what you call the system as long as it works. And that's why they use this term socialism with Chinese characteristics as a way of including everything. But actually, more recently, you'll hear something else, which leads to the second element of legitimacy. And this, I think, would push back, actually, Rudra, against the premise of your question, because you said this isn't what we expect from communism. And nowadays, even in the outside world, China's leaders are much more happy to say very openly, we are Marxists. That's what we do. And anyone who thinks that Marxism is about being poor or being backwards or being corrupt doesn't understand that maybe the Soviet Union got it wrong, but we got it right, because we're Marxists, we're communists. We can tell because the name is in our, the name is in the party. We're called the Chinese Communist Party. And we do that. We believe in Marxist theory. We believe in the idea of contradictions, which come together with opposing theses and antitheses, which lead to synthesis, like the Hegelian idea. All of this stuff. They're very. If you read their journals, they're very into the philosophy of Marxism. But they say, but why shouldn't Marxism done right produce automobiles and summer holidays in nice places and high-speed trains? Because we're Marxists. And we've done it. So that's the second element, that Marxism-Leninism is real. And it's not just Marxism in terms of economics, but Leninism in terms of top-down control. The argument that by doing this, by having this party state in which the leadership is untouchable, but they have the freedom to do what they're going to do, we provide the lifestyle that you see for today's Chinese. The third element is essentially what I was saying at the beginning, but one that I think tends to be underappreciated, which is China's own modern history. China's leadership draw both on China's history of being invaded and occupied over and over again, Opium Wars, Russo-Japanese War, which despite the title was actually held on Chinese territory, and then World War II against the Japanese, as a sign that the outside world can't be trusted. Only a strong ruling party, the Communist Party, can defend China against the outside world. And the flip side is also the revolutionary modern history. It's 100 years this year, July 1st, since July 1st, 1921, since the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. And all of the legends of the past, which of course are historically, based, the Long March of the 1930s, Chinese leaders still talk and think about these in a very, very active way. This is not past history. This is very much part of the way in which they think about themselves in the present day. So modern history is the third thing. The fourth one, and the final one in my list, was really very downplayed through much of the 20th century, but has come back in a big way in the 21st. And that is what you might call Confucianism, or broadly speaking, traditional Chinese philosophy. They don't always call it that, but essentially a lot of the moral terms in which the Chinese Communist Party talks about itself today would have been recognized by any Confucian bureaucrat of the Ming dynasty or the Qing dynasty or whatever. Ideas of virtue, ideas of righteousness, idea of filial duty to parents. These are not particularly, I think unlike the economics, they would say those aren't particularly communist values in their pure form, but that China's Communist Party is eclectic and changeable and flexible enough to incorporate them. So by drawing on Chinese tradition, they make a link to that deep past the Chinese feel. By providing economic benefits in Marxism, they provide the link to modernity. And by referring to modern history, they give this sense of grievance overcome that binds the wider population to the party itself. That's where the legitimacy, I think, comes from, Rudra.
Thank you, Rana. May I ask Mr. S.N. Mukherjee to ask the first question, followed by Mr. Rupen Roy to ask the second.
Please.
Rana, I have actually 3 questions.
Oh.
And before I put them to you, welcome on this virtual platform.
Thank you.
On behalf of all of us, great to see you here and speaking to us. I've heard you speak in the Jaipur Lit Festival some time ago. It's the recent events which has really given rise to these 3 related questions. First is the Chinese enthusiasm to do business with the Taliban. The question really is it merely an economic reason which shows this enthusiasm, or is there something more? Second, you might have seen recent reports, very recent reports suggesting that Pakistan, Russia, and China have been invited to the Taliban government formation ceremony. Do you see a new geopolitical axis developing, considering that Pakistan did have military exercises in the recent past with Russia, and Putin won the Confucius Peace Prize? And the third question is, what does all this mean for India, which had a pretty strong foothold in Afghanistan while the US troops were there?
Yeah, thanks very much, Anissa. I'm just writing those down so that I don't forget the different parts. But in fact, they're all aspects of, they're really sort of 3 parts to one very important question, which of course has become thrust into the limelight in just the last 3 to 5 weeks, really. So very, very recent. I think that the interpretation I would want to put across all of that is that, as far as we can tell so far, and it's a rapidly changing situation, the Chinese were not either aiming to bring about, nor have they been, on principle, very happy about the Taliban takeover. They are happy about one specific aspect of it, but one aspect only, which is the humiliation of the United States and its allies in Afghanistan. That they are happy about, and they've been very clear, in public and social media type statements that that's the case. And India, of course, I think in a broad sense, in this context, would be regarded as an American ally in that context, in the way that Pakistan would not, since it's obviously very close to the Chinese. So in terms of being able to gloat, be able to boast, I think that there is some pleasure that's been taken. But in policy terms, actually, I think an awful lot of people in China's policymaking elite see this as a really terrible move that needs a very, very heavy defense posture against it. So first of all, that relatively small but significant outcrop of Afghanistan into Chinese, the border with Chinese territory, the Wakhan corridor, is seen by China as a place of huge vulnerability, because of course it borders on Xinjiang province, which technically it's an autonomous region, not rather than a province, but essentially it's a province, where of course China has essentially, it's been reliably reported that large numbers of the local Uyghur population have been subjected to re-education camps. And the major justification China gives for this is anti-terrorism. Now, we could have a different argument about whether or not this is plausible in any way, and there've been some horrific reports about what's come out from the camps. But what is undoubtedly true is that one of the most terrifying scenarios for China is the emergence of some sort of radical Islamically based political movement emerging as an insurgency just across the border in Afghanistan or beyond. So one of their primary aims is to make sure that whatever government emerges in Afghanistan is one that is stable and which preserves China's interests. And the interests are twofold. The first is the security interest. So basically getting in early, offering to shower around lots of Belt and Road money. Of course, according to the regional neighbors, Pakistan and Russia, with whom Beijing has a good relationship, excellent relationship with Pakistan, perfectly decent relationship with Moscow, if in some ways not as close as people always think, and basically finding some sort of way to clamp the country down. Now, because China, unlike the United States and its allies, have never had to make any kind of claim that they want to bring democracy to the country, as long as they can actually find a way to argue they've brought stability to the country and an economic model that at least is tolerable, they'll be happy with that. What they won't be doing, and this is, again, one of the things the Chinese would say about themselves, but I think it's true in this case, they won't be looking to impose any particular sort of political system on Afghanistan. And in that sense, they don't regard it, I think, as part of a kind of alliance of like-minded nations or anything of that sort. They see it much more as a problem to be solved. But the other element of the interest, which I think they are very keen to draw upon, are the economic interests, both in copper and in oil. These are going to be difficult to exploit, but if anyone can essentially bring in the equipment to do so, it's probably the Chinese. And I think that they will regard their relationship with both Pakistan and Russia in this context as being one that essentially is a pragmatic one that combines their security and economic interests. In terms of what it means for India, well, I think China's probably not going to think that much actively about what it means for India, by which I mean they will regard India as having, in a rather lukewarm and sort of passive way, been essentially drawing on the presence of the United States and the NATO allies in terms of stability in the region. And now that that presence has, comprehensively been removed, they will essentially regard anyone, any state associated with that region as being losers in this particular geopolitical game. That said, my guess, and it's only a guess, is that they will still try and restrain their own allies and supporters within Afghanistan, linked to any other region countries, from making it too obvious a site of border friction with India. Because it's one thing, I think, for China to press on its own border between India and China, which, as we know, is extremely sensitive for one and has been in the last year and a half in particular. It's another thing for them to do so through a proxy. And I think that they are extremely wary of inflaming any conflict in the region which they can't control. And I can tell you, to finish this thought, the very last thing, the worst possible outcome for China in their minds, they won't say this, but I think this is right. If any Chinese friends are listening, hi, you can contradict me, but I think this is true. The one thing the Chinese don't want to do is to send Chinese troops into Afghanistan. They've seen what happened to the Soviets. They've seen what happened to the Americans. They've seen what happened to the British beforehand as well. There is absolutely no way, if they can avoid it, they will send People's Liberation Army troops into Afghanistan. That means that since it all has to be done through proxies, it's a much trickier and much less certain geopolitical play than being able to actually launch an occupation. So the Chinese will see opportunities, but I think they're much more fragile opportunities than some of the rhetoric has suggested in recent days. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Rupen, right? You have to unmute your...
Can you hear me?
Hello?
Yeah. So I have a question.
Sure.
When Deng Xiaoping gave the slogan of to get rich is glorious, was when the real economic progress started. But some people, like our Ramakrishna's Takamati Matitaka people, misunderstood. And you had Boji Lai in Chongqing, who was a tall and very important leader, but he's still in Xinjiang prison for 8 years. So
Yep.
what is the story about corruption at the highest possible circles in the Chinese Communist Party?
So I would say that corruption, which has become something that actually ordinary Chinese people, even on social media, quite openly talk about in a big way, is probably one of the defining characteristics of the politics of China today, by which I mean the following. in the 2000s to early 2010s, it was generally acknowledged that under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, China's economic growth had continued very strongly. And then the world economic crisis hit in 2008. And basically a whole bunch of credit was injected at high speed into the Chinese economy, thereby creating a new credit boom. And in terms of stopping China from falling into the kind of economic disaster that some other countries did after 2008, there's general consensus that actually that was probably quite a successful policy, as well as giving China more confidence in terms of taking a different economic path. However, not uniquely to China, but certainly visible in China, suddenly injecting very large amounts of essentially free money into the economy and telling local governments to spend it as they might see fit, supposedly on infrastructure, but also on the kickbacks that come from that, turned out to have an unsurprising effect. Actually, lots of infrastructure got built. We've seen everything from high-speed trains and airports and roads, whatever it might be, but also lots of people got very rich through no effort of their own. And by the time Xi Jinping came in the early 2010s, he's someone I think who I suspect would probably be rather successful electorally if there were actually elections in China. I mean, there aren't elections in China, there aren't going to be any, but he acts often very much in the mode of a politician who's acting to try and find what it is that's going to shore up his own image. I mean, the cult of personality he has is one of those, a bit like Donald Trump in some way, very much based around him personally and his image, but also thinking, what can I do to really make sure that I can do something that will appeal to how people feel in the here and now, the everyday. And he saw that one of the complaints that a lot of ordinary people had, middle-class working people, is I have more money, but also I feel constrained and oppressed by the party because actually getting anything done involves having to give bribes or, see all these amazing, luxury goods that some of the party officials have. And from the very first thing he did was pretty much to launch an anti-corruption campaign. Now, many people have pointed out that this anti-corruption campaign from then till now has some important exceptions. Possibly factional politicians who are close to Xi Jinping may not find themselves being fingered in quite that sort of a way, in a way that politicians who are in the political firing line will be. Although, of course, that position and status can change quite quickly as people see. But the overall effect, and this isn't often reported as much, is quite clear. Look at opinion poll surveys, and there are quite a few done within China with authorization, but they're reasonably authentic in most cases. Most people do perceive that overall corruption levels are perceived to have gone down very heavily in the last 10 years. Now, whether they've actually gone down in all areas is a different question, but the wider population feels that there's more pushback against corruption in the present day in China than there was 10 or 15 years ago. So in that sense, I think it's put Xi Jinping, in terms of his own personal politics, in a rather favorable position, because he is perceived as being someone who is incredibly hardline. Absolutely no doubt about that. The relatively limited space for free speech and media and so forth that existed, social media, in the 2010s has now really shrunk away. Hong Kong, another good example of how they've shrunk further. But in terms of his personal image as someone who cracks down on corruption, that's also pretty strong amongst the wider population. And in a country that's never had a very strong liberal tradition, that so far has proved quite a successful way for him to create a story about who he is. So that's one of the ways in which I think the story about corruption has become politically or the story of anti-corruption has become quite politically astute in the way that Xi and the ruling party have played it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Anurag Srivastav, who's the managing director, he's an IS officer, managing director of the Warehousing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Chatterjee. I would like to ask, what would be the impact of COVID? For example, China, there are glorious years and China has done economically very well. But in the global order, one, the secrecy around the origin of COVID and the cooperation of China with the with the WHO and other countries. And second, COVID did not hit China in the manner that it devastated US, India, various other countries, but China did not suffer that fate. So post that, how much will countries trust China and what will be the impact of that?
Well, great question. Thank you for that. I mean, COVID, I think, is definitely a phenomenon which is changing the way that China will interact with the world, as well as what happens domestically. I think, and other people have started to put this forward, but I think they're right. that one big change that will happen in the near future is that China will be much less open to the outside world than has been the case, up to now. China has been obviously, very, very constrained politically for years and years now. But in terms of, business people, whatever, coming in and out, you fly to Shanghai, do 3 days of business, fly out Washington or Mumbai or wherever, that possibility has gone for the moment. It really isn't possible for anyone without very specialist business to go into China without quarantining for at least 3 weeks, maybe longer. And for most people, that's not possible. So essentially, under the kind of overall umbrella of health, China has managed to create a situation where actually very few outsiders can come in and out. That enables it to concentrate on its own domestic politics and create even more of this kind of strongly technologically enabled, highly authoritarian society even more strongly. Second, I think that a number of things that are coming up in the near future mean that the reopening of China is going to be something that probably could easily be a couple of years from this point. They're not going to open up the country fully because they're going to have the Winter Olympics coming up fairly soon. So like Tokyo, they're going to restrict everyone else except the athletes. That'll keep it all quite restricted. Then there's the big party congress next year, 2022, when Xi Jinping will likely bid for a third term for leadership as general secretary. Around those sorts of big political events, China gets very, very cautious. It doesn't let many people in anyway. And, this is the perfect reason to say, well, we just can't do it now. So by then you're looking into middle 2023 before actually China is in the position to reopen. And the third factor, which brings that decision to a head, is how far and how fast can China vaccinate? So you were quite right to point out at the beginning that China, having locked itself down very fast, having realized that in fact that the virus was spreading, and refusing to kind of say very much about it at the beginning, causing huge protests on Chinese social media, they basically initiated a massive vaccination campaign. But because they're using their own designed vaccines, they've found by this point that the vaccines are okay, they're decent, but they're not as good as the leading vaccines, which most other countries, including India, of course, are using, the ones that either are made by or based on the AstraZeneca, Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson models. Some of those are better than others, but they're all very much in the top tier. Sinovac, Sinopharm, and others are in the second tier, although they are significantly better than not vaccinating at all. Now, although they will not discuss this in public, or I'd be very surprised if they did, I suspect that people at the top level in China's health administration and in the party are deciding how plausible it is to reopen both domestic business and international business when you have a population that is well vaccinated, but not as immunized throughout this huge population as probably an equivalently sized population, or there's no equivalent except for India really, but a large size populated country elsewhere in the world that's had, say, 75% vaccination, because 75% vaccination of a population with a vaccine that protects you 90% of the time is different from the same proportion, but 50% of the time. I don't think any of us, including China, yet knows how those calculations are going to come together. But all of those, I think, are the factors that really shape the way that China thinks about what COVID is doing. And since it's got already a prominent program to indigenize as much industrial production as possible, made in China 2025 is the overall phrase that gets used for that, I think a period when it's forced, in a sense, to separate a bit from the world has some short-term real difficulties in terms of supply chains and economic links. But in the longer term, China may make the calculation that it's worth it if they end up with a country that is actually works really well for China in terms of an internal, kind of well-running economy, but with actually more limited links to the outside world that the party can control, which I suspect that they'd be quite in favor of doing.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. I'd like to call on Mohan Chandran. Mohan is heads the Taj hotels in Rajasthan. So if you ever visit, he's currently in Lake Palace. I'm looking forward to seeing him soon. Mohan, your question.
Thank you, Rudro. Professor, my questions, is there any scenario where you foresee Russian and Chinese interests converging, in the sense that certainly both consider Eurasia, etc., their backyard. They both have interests in the region. And a subset to that, which was a hypothetical, about 200 years ago, we saw this opium war, which in a sense is perhaps an outcome of the trade and payments imbalance between Great Britain then and the Chinese. Given today's imbalance of a similar nature between the US and China, do we foresee something dramatic like this occurring in the future? That's
You
it.
mean something like the Opium War, you mean?
Well, an equivalent of that, some kind of a dramatic confrontation, an armed confrontation, let's say.
Yeah. No, understand. Yeah, well, thanks again. Very, very interesting question. I think, but of course, these things are very, very hard to predict, that I would go with the judgment of one of the most astute and unsentimental Chinese analysts of international politics, Professor Yan Xietong of Tsinghua University, whose most recent book, Leadership and the Great Powers, is available in English and well worth reading. His case, and I think it's right, is that the relationship between China and the United States is likely to be extremely cold for quite some time to come, because essentially each one regards the other as a sort of existential global competitor who cannot be allowed, in the case of the United States, cannot allow China to overcome it, and in the case of China, cannot allow itself essentially to be contained by the US. So, these are fundamentally at some level incompatible goals. That said, if it were just a question of a purely bilateral relationship and a sort of zero-sum relationship, I think that will be one thing. But actually, one of the things that all of us, who are involved in countries that are not the US or China, which I think is most people on this call, will realize that it's not just those two countries, however powerful they are, who get to have a say. And obviously the view of India, the view of major European economies, France, Germany, the UK, the European Union, Canada, all of these are places, Japan, who have a voice in this particular process. And I think because of the way in which China understands that any actions on its part will not just be reflected in the US, but also with the powerful set of allies that the United States has, but also the way that the United States does, I think, understand quite centrally that the economic balance of the world, and certainly of Asia, has moved so far towards China being at the center that it's impossible to create an order in the region now in which some way China isn't involved economically. These two factors will lead to essentially a probably rather precarious but real balance between the two sides. And what Yan Xietong says that essentially that would lead to an extremely cold relationship between the two principal actors, but one that nonetheless doesn't tip over into an actual confrontation, because it would involve essentially a variety of outcomes that are simply too damaging for either side to manage. And in the case of China, just to understand for a moment what that would be, supposing there were a confrontation over Taiwan, which is the example that people quite often give. Actually, I'm not sure. I think the sort of the strategics of invading Taiwan are actually so difficult that and also they'd have to be flagged well ahead, because satellites would spot huge numbers of troops gathering on the coast of Fujian. But supposing you had that scenario somehow or other, I don't think it would immediately trigger a war in the sense of missiles being fired, not least because Taiwan is not under treaty protection in the way that Japan or South Korea are with the United States. But I think there's a very high likelihood it could lead to a really powerful sanctions move by actors in the region who basically have a vested interest in not letting China control most of the sea passage of that area. And Japan in particular, I think, has made it clearer and clearer that this is a scenario that it would find very difficult to accept. And I suspect that the United States, while of course very much present in the region, might find that it was in a better position to actually coordinate a set of responses to China. Now, if you have China that is genuinely cut off from international supply chains and sanctioned, maybe even cut out of the international banking system, yes, this would be painful, immensely painful for the rest of the world, but I think it would be hugely disruptive to China's economic scenario, much worse than COVID, which has been a huge blow. And in the end, you have to think back to what it is that the Chinese communist leaders really want. What they want is a stable China under their absolute unquestioned rule, which is highly controlled and which is safe within their borders. And I still think that if calculation about a piece of confrontation might lead to a scenario that would destroy where they think they are at the moment, which is some version of that, middle income, relatively stable scenario, I think that the leadership would find that that was not a move they were willing to take. That is, of course, only what I can extrapolate. I have no, direct communications or means of knowing what's going on inside people's heads in Beijing. And people are not always rational in Washington, Beijing, New Delhi, or London, or anywhere else. You can't rely on that. But that seems to me to be at least a rational calculation of the risks, which Beijing is certainly able to see. Whether they go with it is another matter, but it's very visible.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rajesh Rathore, who's an IS officer with the West Bengal Industrial Development Corporation.
Good evening, Professor. I have a question regarding the controlled exchange rate by China. So, as we know, they have achieved huge economic progress and there are huge foreign exchange reserves. So going forward, is it manageable? And how long do you think China will see benefit in such a controlled regime?
Yeah, thanks very much. Really important question. I mean, as you've seen, they've kind of over the years gently let the value of the renminbi change without ever kind of officially flagging it. So actually, the question of currency undervaluation, which was a huge and very politically controversial issue, maybe 7-8 years ago, is less immediate, at least in comparison with the dollar, is less of an immediate problem now. But there's a wider policy issue. I'll give you my thoughts on it. I can't guarantee this is right, but there seems to me that there's a politics behind it. China's move, which I think at one point was really, they were keen to accelerate it towards essentially making the renminbi into a fully internationally traded currency, I think is on indefinite hold. Because the realization that there is a fundamental contradiction, to use a good Marxist term, between having really very strong and active control of your currency and becoming a genuinely globally traded international reserve currency is too great for them to bridge. I mean, essentially it was, I mean, the dollar has been the dominant currency obviously for a very long time, but nonetheless, it was essentially the changes between the 1970s and 1990s in terms of international currency trading, the freeing up of exchange rate, the destruction of the old Bretton Woods system, which Nixon really started in the 70s. All of that basically meant that the world of highly controlled currencies is much less plausible today in terms of currencies that want to be used as, genuinely international trading instruments. I think the renminbi also has a couple of other problems that are not, for the moment, applicable to the dollar. Despite the ups and downs of American politics over the last few years and even now, people still ultimately believe, maybe mistakenly, but they do believe in the stability of the United States as a lender or a borrower or an issuer of last resort. And they believe that the Fed is ultimately independent, and they believe that, broadly speaking, the dollar is a currency which they can rely on. That's one of the reasons the Americans, of course, to some extent weaponize that by making it clear that they feel they have a stake in which countries can and can't use the dollar for international trading, Iran being the obvious example of that. So can Beijing actually replace that meaningfully? Well, certainly their new digital currency is a tryout to try and do that. But the problem is that nobody really, including in Beijing, I think, believes that the Chinese currency is entirely free from very opaque political control. Nobody thinks that the governor of the People's Bank of China, who's a very distinguished economist, could really go to the top leaders of the Chinese Communist Party and say, no, you can't do X, Y, and Z in the way that Paul Volcker told Jimmy Carter no back in the 1970s when he wanted to basically squeeze inflation out of the economy. In addition, because there is this huge desire to control the issuance and flow of renminbi, you can't really hold renminbi with the reliability that you can dollars, yen, or indeed a small amount of sterling that's still out there, to say that it's essentially liquid in that sense. So for all those reasons, I think that for quite some time to come, despite what it says, if it has to make a choice, and to some extent it does have to make a choice, between providing the means for the renminbi to become a genuinely global tradable currency and maintaining really strict political control at home, it will do the latter.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Sanjay Bell. Mr. Sanjay Bell now runs an IT company and used to be the CEO of Raymond's, the suiting.
Thank you. I think, it's a digitization company, which is an evolution to IT and OT, which we call information technology and operational technology. Thanks, Rudra. Thanks very much. And thanks, Professor Rana. I think at the outset, a privilege to receive your perspective and insights. I think it's a very important shaper and influencing factor on global dynamics. So thanks, Rudra, inviting me, and thanks, Rana, for all the insights you've given, sir. My question is very specific to a few conflicting messages that we have received lately. Amidst the otherwise, as you also narrated, very stark level of consistency one otherwise expects from the power centers, Xi Jinping's dispensation. Now, whether we agree with that direction or not, that's okay. But there have been a few conflicting messages, and I would like your perspective on that. Now, the first is clearly China has been working to become an economic superpower in the world and possibly an equal or a better than an US in probably a decade, 2 decades from now. So clearly economic supremacy has been the guiding force for a lot of changes we've seen in the China's last 2 or 3 decade kind of work. Now, while they have embraced global trading and market to base their models, and yet, and this is the conflict I wanted your perspective on, they have visibly suppressed any dissenting voice that comes from possibly even the biggest entrepreneurial magnates that China has produced, like latest being Jack Ma, the whole Alibaba episode, and how they quashed the Ant IPO, within no time of his probably raising a differential point of view. And what was even more surprising is extremely poor PR to back it up. They let the world really roast on that. And that is very, very surprising. So on one hand, you're trying to really, you look at global trade and become an open country. On the other hand, you do that. And that creates a lot of doubting minds. And you've seen China +1 now is being talked about very openly. Every single vendor in the world, which possibly was the founding block for China's economic growth, is looking for an alternative. Vietnam becoming a trade corridor, and there are many of those examples. This is the one part of this question. The second one, it's a corollary possibly, but I just would take this opportunity now that we have you with us. This whole capital colonialism, which is very visible in China's foray in international markets, whether it's African continent, you see in Sri Lanka, where they give multi-billion dollars of debt in a country for a very low rate, and eventually start controlling that. And it's not just in the countries, they've done it to a lot of companies in Europe, where they picked up stake. Virtually whatever Middle East or whatever Caucasian race owned in early 19th century to 20th, Middle East owned in 20th, and now Chinese are owning in 21st. So you see the brand stakes actually changing these hands. Somewhere is India missing a trick here, is the question that I have, because getting countries like Afghanistan and probably getting 20 of these countries and really being a force to balance China's economic power going into Africa, are we missing a trick? Because it's clearly a multi-decadal game. And should we play this game? Because versus India's GDP also, it will be a rounding of error if we decide to pursue the strategy. So these are the 2 questions, Professor.
Great, thanks very much indeed. Well, first of all, lovely to meet you, Sanjay. I'm sure, like many of us, we must have had at least some piece of Raymond's excellent suiting on our arms or our other parts of our anatomy. So great to meet you in person. And thanks for a very interesting 2-parter there, I would say. So first of all, on the question of the crackdown on tech billionaires and the kind of entrepreneurship, you say it's bad PR. It's not bad PR inside China. Inside China, it's been very successful. And as I've said over and over again, I'll stress again, the primary audience for all this is always domestic, particularly at a time when China is looking to draw in its horns in some ways and indigenize as much as possible. I mentioned before, there are a whole variety of economic reasons why China might want to internationalize its currency, but it won't do because of domestic politics. Well, same in terms of this particular strategy here as well. In terms of overall economic growth, you would want to make sure that Chinese companies list on the New York Stock Exchange. You want to make sure that there's a feeling that as much capital as possible can flow in, and that these entrepreneurial characters, Jack Ma is the most famous, but there are plenty of others, get this sort of huge ability to go global. But that, it's clear and clear, is not exactly what the party wants. I mean, if China has these sort of global giants, then to some extent that's fine. But the problem comes, as with Jack Ma, when the perception, maybe not the reality, the perception at home is that he thinks he's bigger than the party, bigger than the leaders, that in some ways he, excuse me, is the most prominent figure. It's not that he necessarily kind of projects that himself, but through his own will, but it's just, if you had to name the most famous Chinese person in the world who's not a politician, so maybe not Xi Jinping, who would it be? It probably is Jack Ma. And that is something that the Chinese party can see as well. And I think they weren't very pleased about it. But it's also a mistake, I think, to concentrate too much just on personalities, because Jack Ma's case is, kind of glamorous story of rise and then fall, and then maybe rise again, we'll see. The underlying issue, I think, is the much bigger one. The way in which China has become also worried, China's authorities, by the growth of tech majors, who they see as potentially if it goes from their point of view the wrong way, will end up like Alphabet, like Google, like Facebook, in other words, so powerful that governments can't control them. That's already difficult for the US government, as we know from the Biden administration. It's an absolute, red zone of being, completely out of court from the Chinese Communist Party's point of view. So they are now putting in strong antitrust laws that probably will mean that most of these companies get split up. If you've got 4 or 5 big majors, there might be 15 of them within 2 or 3 years' time. And the idea is you have smaller companies, it's more competition, but also much more controllable by the party. Yeah, it doesn't look great in the outside world if, they're no longer listed on the New York Stock Exchange. But then ask yourself the following question, which many other countries, including India, have been doing. How much do you really want Chinese tech majors actually controlling your infrastructure anyway? The chances for Huawei in India, I think have gone, probably not coming back. The chances in Western Europe are pretty low. So if that's the case, then why wouldn't you concentrate both on emerging markets, sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, so forth, and also, of course, your own domestic market? And that gives you a very different sort of political narrative. The flip side about colonialism, I've always taken a slightly more kind of questioning view of this story, not least because I was recently talking actually to someone involved with the Sri Lankan central bank. I think the story is a bit more complex. If you reconstitute the story and tell it this way, I think it looks different. Basically, China, not least partly because of the credit boom, created a whole bunch of capital that it needed to allocate. Much of it was not very well allocated at home. I mean, Beijing now has 2 international airports, and it's a big, important city, but really doesn't need that level of infrastructure. So where's all this capital going to go? Well, basically, the Chinese, like anyone else, can look around the world and see there are a heck of a lot of people who want to borrow money. And some of those people can't borrow money because what they want to invest it in isn't very likely to provide a return. Now, in some cases, like the Piraeus port in Greece, they probably have invested quite wisely from their point of view. But the point about the Piraeus port is that actually it's making money and it's repaying on its investment. So the Chinese aren't in a position simply to seize it. In other cases, they've invested in things that actually are very unlikely to provide a return, even if they get hold of them over time. I think that if they wish to control, the politics and trade of particular countries, the Chinese have many, many resources through which they could do that. Issuing loans to dodgy business enterprises is probably not the most cost-effective way of actually doing that. And I think it's indicative that in the last year before the pandemic, the amount of lending in terms of infrastructure was really way down through the BRI, which if it was a proper colonial move, I think they wouldn't have been doing because it's not really about the money. Instead, it's moved much more into what they can see as areas where China has a first or second mover advantage. The healthcare rollout of vaccines, which we'll discuss a little bit. And as I say, it's not the greatest vaccine rollout in the world, but it's one that a lot of countries are still quite happy to take. In terms of Green Silk Road stuff, basically renewables, renewable energy, that's where a lot of the energy is going. Because in the end, what China also needs is to make sure that its economic model is sustainable. And in the end, controlling some not particularly useful ports is not a way to actually create that kind of return, but probably investing in biotech and green technology and energy, renewable energy, is going to be a much more plausible scenario for the future. And unless the rest of the world, and again, you talked about, I think you, Sanjay, or perhaps the previous speaker, talked about opportunities for India, these have got to be the areas where India finds relative advantage. If it is able to develop technologies from its own very strong scientific resources, if it can manufacture in the way that China does and add its own expertise and services in areas like renewable energy, I think that's going to be part of where the pushback comes. I don't think India should be going around the world building airports in Central Africa. I don't think that's a useful use of expertise or of financial resources. Thanks for that.
Thank you very much.
Rudra, can I throw back to just a quick one, because we're having a lovely time. In probably about 5 to 7 minutes, I'm going to have to head off at that stage. And also just to say, I see that we have a bit of gender variance in the questions being asked. So if there's going to be gender variance in the questions I can answer, that would also be good as well.
That's true. That's true. If I'll just ask a question, Rana, and if there's any more questions, especially after this, I'll love to take it. This is from the president of the Bengal Club, who's signed in, but he's not got his video on. His question is about Mr. Ambarij Dasgupta. His question is about there's articles about China wanting a fairer society, redistribution. He sent me an article from Bloomberg. Do you think that is likely, and if that, what would be the impact of that? And then I'll ask last one. If there's someone with the last question, we'll take that and then close.
Okay. So great question. The phrase that's being used is 共同富裕, common prosperity, and that's now the absolute buzzword in China today. Everyone's talking about that. I will be giving actually a talk later this week to a bunch of people in Hong Kong. And my original topic, they wrote back and said, could you change that? Could you just talk about common prosperity? Because that's the only thing that anyone cares about in China right now. So fine. You say fairer society. I've actually written a longer piece, and you can find it for free online on the British Guardian website, just published a couple of days ago, about this question. And the short version of my answer, because essentially I was answering a sort of similar question to one that you've asked, is this: is the drive towards greater economic fairness and equality real? And I think the answer is yes. I think there is genuine concern about the level of inequality where you have people, literally billionaires in Ferraris, and then people who are still living on less than $6 a day. And this is, if you are, as I mentioned before, running the world's largest Marxist party, and one that argues that it's a great success, this isn't sustainable over the long term. So that's behind a lot of these crackdowns on billionaires and their tax affairs, and movie stars not paying their tax, this sort of thing. How quickly and how fast it can go, we have to see, because of course they don't want to also shut down the growth that comes from entrepreneurship. But that having been said, these people are on notice, I think, in a way that wasn't the case before, that their activities are being monitored and potentially disapproved of. But beyond that, there is, I think, a more problematic side. And that is that the flip side of thinking that there needs to be more equality is also a rather, I think, depressing push towards the idea that there has to be more similarity in terms of society. In other words, people who have different choices when it comes to ethnicity, or their personal habits, or even on gender questions, actually is one of the major ones too. And certainly the way in which different viewpoints, not necessarily about politics even, but actually about lifestyles and how people live. These things are all now being cracked down on in a big way as well. In other words, I think that there is an aspiration right now for China to become over time more economically equal while prosperous, but also in some ways more monolithic. I mean, not in the way that the old Cultural Revolution was in the 60s. I think China would find it very hard to go back to that. But the idea that being quirky or being different, or in some ways, showing your individuality, as it were, individuality, but only within very, very close limits that are being defined by the state. So I think that push goes in both directions. Should we fit in a last one there, Rudra?
Sure. Manojda, would you like to ask the last question?
Professor, it's really been fascinating, but we've missed one aspect which I think is very relevant to India in particular. And Rudra started, and I'll take off from where Rudra started, saying China is a bit of a riddle. So I'll complete that by saying, China is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. So will you use that to explain why the Ladakh incursions happened on the 5th of May last year, at a time when the world was grappling with COVID, and things between India and China were reasonably peaceable until then. And Modi had met Chinese premier several times, and there was really, and then of course, Galwan happened on the 15th of June, and things became from bad to worse with the loss of lives. So what was the trigger for China to indulge in transgressions at that time, A? And B, where do you see this, given that 9 or 10 rounds of talks have really led us nowhere? Where do you see this will finally settle? Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. And yes, no, perhaps that's a good one to think about as we come near the end. I mean, first of all, the thing about the riddle wrapped inside the enigma, etc., which was, Winston Churchill, I think, said that about Russia, in fact. But I would point you to the words of Zhou Enlai, the old Chinese foreign minister, who, when I think Nixon or someone said to him that China was very hard to work out, he said, but for us Chinese, it is not mysterious at all. So I think it's worth pointing out that these things depend on where you're sitting. In terms of Ladakh last year, I agree that it's hard to know exactly what the policy really was trying to do. It doesn't seem to be entirely sensible to have provoked this. I suspect the answer to your question, I don't know from the inside, of course, is that it was a miscalculation. essentially China has been seeking, to push on that border for quite some time. And, there were no fatalities really since the mid-1970s. So I suspect there's probably a calculation that pushing a bit further would have ended up with a similar sort of non-fatal standoff. And I suspect that the surprise in Beijing was almost as great as it ended up being in the wider world, including, of course, in India as well. My sense is that it is not something in that way that's likely to happen again, because now China is under, kind of siege on so many fronts, that actually having a scenario in which it is, forced to take another kind of border crisis on board isn't something it wants to do at the moment. But I think that it's certainly the case that China tries to calculate where its interest can best be met at any particular time. It's also the case that that calculation isn't always successful. Anyway, thanks for that question and those answers. Rudra, I'll throw back to you at the end here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rana. And thank you to more than, at one time, 170, now more than 140 people who've stayed and listened to this analysis. It was very interesting, very new for many of us. And we hope that both on behalf of FICCI and Bengal Club, that we can physically welcome you to Kolkata and have a physical event. Thank you very much. And hopefully some of you who enjoyed this talk would read Rana Mitter's book. The latest one is China's Good War. And the earlier one is Forgotten Ally, their role in the Second World War. Thank you very much, everybody, and good night.
Thank you very much, Rudra, and thank you all, and good afternoon from me. Bye-bye for now.